Legend and the Photographer, a novel by DT Mann. Stephen Legend has broad shoulders and stands well over 6 feet tall. He works out a couple of hours a day. He likes to be fit, but it also helps to relieve him of some of his stress, anger, and frustration. Stephen was married to Renee. They had a happy marriage, and he loved her deeply. They had a beautiful daughter named Becky. She had his dark hair and eyes, and Renee's fair skin and looks. After they made love one night, Renee turned to Stephen and asked him to think about something. They lived a different type of lifestyle than most couples, and she thought she'd like to keep it from their daughter. It's not that she didn't love living it or want to continue living it, but she wanted to keep it from Becky until she was old enough to understand it, ask proper questions of them, and to choose how she wanted to live her life all on her own. Renee suggested that maybe he could build a room downstairs that could be theirs. Some people who live lives of a dominant and submissive have what they call a playroom and keep it locked at all times. They didn't really live that lifestyle. Theirs was only mildly dominant, where Stephen was the boss of the family, and he made all important decisions. He would also spank Renee sometimes for play, before or during sex, or sometimes as discipline. That was it, and it was always done with his hand and never anywhere other than her backside. They would play with toys and try things, but nothing as dramatic as those in the BDSM lifestyle, and they were both happy. They also found there were many others living the same type of lifestyle as they were, so they were in the process of meeting people living their life. Stephen did think about what she had said for the next couple of days and knew she was right. He couldn't live with himself if he thought his beautiful daughter had gotten into his lifestyle too early because of him and ended up with a real dominant or someone pretending to be one. Renee was right. He would build a room for them downstairs and keep it locked and away from Becky. The day he finished making the changes, he could hardly wait for the girls to come home from their shopping trip. He was dying to show Renee what he had done and tell her he realized they had made the right decision. Renee and Becky didn't come home, though. 2 Ontario provincial police officers came to his door to tell him of the accident. It was an accident that guaranteed Stephen's girls would never come home again. In his mind, Stephen was sure that they had paid for his deviance. No matter what Derek, his best friend and partner, or any other friend or family member said, he continued to believe they were taken away to punish him. Since that day, he has never been happy. When he smiles, it never shows in his eyes. He just exists, unable to feel anything deeper than surface emotion. Chapter 1. Rikki hated the name Erica. Named after her father Eric, she preferred to be called Rikki. She had developed decent photographic skills, but always played it safe for her business. When it came to choosing her subjects, babies and school pictures were all Rikki offered to her customers, in addition to the occasional family portrait. Any pictures she took out of the ordinary or for fun, she didn't share with anyone. She loved to go off on her own and take pictures of her province's beautiful landscape. She enjoyed experimenting with different effects. The scenery in southern Ontario was fantastic, with its beautiful parks and waterfalls, the most famous being the mighty Niagara Falls. But there were also smaller ones, in little towns and cities nearby, people weren't aware of. Then came the unfortunate day Rikki paid a friend's son Gary to come over and clean her studio. He was a good kid who needed after-school and weekend work. She trusted him and always gave him as much work as she could. She told his mom she would give his name to the other merchants as well. She gave him the keys and made sure there were no appointments booked for the weekends or evenings he was to clean. That way he had the place to himself and could clean at his own pace. She had no idea Gary would discard the boxes containing her private photos. He had left the boxes for Rikki to sift through and either donate or discard. She threw out the garbage and donated her private photos to a photography school. This was the first time she didn't go through everything. She was always told she made more work for herself by redoing everyone else's work, so she discarded and donated without checking the boxes. Drove her crazy, like an itch she couldn't scratch, but she did it. Garbage or donations? What harm could it do, for heaven's sakes? She never noticed the absence of her secret collection of pictures until she had a visit from Derek Beamer. Abby, Rikki's best friend, frequently came to the studio and helped when Rikki was busy, or when Abby wanted to go out of the house for the day, which was often. The two girls had known each other since they were kids in public school. They arranged sleepovers, had crushes on the same boys, and were always together. Abby was so confident and beautiful that Rikki envied her. They both stood no more than 5 feet tall, and Abby's dad commented they were his two girls, 5 feet nothing and full of piss and vinegar. They were two peas in a pod, until the day Rikki's parents sat her down and informed her they were divorcing. That's when her world fell apart. The day they told her was the last day she ever saw her mother. From then on, it was her and her dad. Rikki was 13, and he was a drunk. In his alcoholic rages, he blamed her for her mother's leaving, and as if that weren't bad enough for a 13-year-old to hear, he always added venomously that he wished she hadn't been born, or that Abby had been his daughter instead. He would tell her repeatedly how much smarter and more beautiful Abby was. Hell, this young girl's mind was dominated by the feeling that not even her own mother cared enough to take her along when she left. The continuous put-downs reinforced the feeling her father gave her. She was a nothing and a nobody. When she reached 18, she left home permanently and did not see her father again, which was just fine as far as she was concerned. Rikki didn't hate Abby because of her father's rants. The few times Abby heard them, she made Rikki promise to ignore him, and especially not to believe him. She agreed, but deep down she did believe a list of defects he constantly enjoyed pointing out. She even added some of her own. No matter what Mr. and Mrs. Fine or Abby said, Rikki continued to believe in her own lack of endearing qualities, and as a result, her self-image sank lower than ever. She tried her best to ignore her feelings and convinced herself that the only things that mattered were her pictures and her work. Rikki worked part-time in Mr. Lang's photographic studio, and when he found out she was leaving home, he allowed her to sleep in a room at the back of the studio. He mentored her gently and constantly, and one day offered her a proposition. He would teach her everything he knew about the photography business as long as she promised she would stay in school. When Abby's parents found out Rikki was sleeping in Mr. Lang's back room, they opened up their home to her. Rikki cared deeply for the Fines. They were wonderful people. She could take care of herself without being in anyone's debt. She wanted to take care of herself, so she stayed in Mr. Lang's back room and was happy there alone. Rikki visited the Fines often, and that seemed to make them happy. She never had to tell anyone where she was going or what she was doing, not that she had when she lived with her dad. Sometimes she thought it would have been nice if someone cared enough to want to know where she was, how she was, and what she was doing.